So next we have Bruno Olshausen, who is a professor of neuroscience and optometry at UC Berkeley, and who's also the director of the Redwood Center for Theoretical Neuroscience. So Bruno received his PhD from Caltech and then went on to do some really famous work in which he developed the sparse coding model of visual cortex, which actually links between statistical properties of natural scenes and the response properties of the visual cortex or visual neurons. And Bruno's research interests aim to understand the information processing strategies that are employed for the by the brain for doing things like object recognition or scene processing. And his work is really interesting for our workshop because not only it is about understanding how the brain works, but it's also about understanding how we can build better algorithms for scene analysis using what we learned from the brain. So with that being said, please join me in welcoming Bruno.
Thanks, Layla. All right. Good to see everybody. Thanks for having me. So I guess what I'd like to turn to here is thinking about common sense reasoning further back in the evolutionary chain, particularly in jumping spiders, which I'll tell you some more about. And then tell you about some work we're doing on trying to understand the neural computations that underlie our ability to do geometric reasoning. And this is work with students Hoyun Shao, Yubei Chen, and Frank Chi. So I guess the main points I'd like to try to make here is that a lot of our, what we call common sense, really derives from our ancestors, not just mammalian ancestors, but many other animals in the animal kingdom, their need to survive in a changing physical environment. So the real world is always throwing new things at you, new situations at you. And so this is just, it's not going to be sufficient enough just to learn simple rules in order to survive and deal with these kinds of worlds. You really need some kind of general purpose reasoning. They developed the ability to develop internal models of the world that allow you to reason about novel situations. One form of this reasoning is geometric reasoning. And this is what allows animals to navigate, to orient, and to plan routes to forage or to capture prey. So I'll give you some examples of this in jumping spiders. And then finally, the interesting question is, from a neural point of view, how are these kinds of computations implemented in brains? And so what I'm going to argue is with the right mathematical primitives that we can design efficient ways of computing these geometric transformations in neural circuits. Okay, so let's just start off with jumping spiders. So what makes jumping spiders fascinating and how they differ from other spiders is that they do not rely upon a web to extend their sensory space. They rely entirely on their visual system to find prey and to detect prey and find where they are and to hunt them. And so what you can see here on the left is shown just a cross section of their head. So what distinguishes the jumping spiders, this is highly developed visual system. They have 8 eyes or 4 pairs of eyes, which you can see here. Two of these two at the front, the anteromedian eyes, point forward and have relatively narrow field of view, but very high resolution. And their retina is at the back of these long tubes. And as you can see here, that retina is basically a one-dimensional strip of photoreceptors. And they scan that back and forth inside the head to build up an image of what's going on in the world. So these are very high resolution eyes. They have on the order of about 10 minutes of arc resolution, about the same as a cat. Okay, but they have kind of tunnel vision. And so to see the other parts of the visual field, they use these other eyes. And these other eyes on the side of their head combined give them a full 360-degree field of view. They have low resolution, but they can detect where things are in the world. So the way they typically employ the visual system is to use these low resolution eyes to find something interesting moving, and then they orient their head towards it to image it with these high resolution eyes to see what it is. As you mentioned, they, beyond detecting prey, they can also use these high resolution eyes to recognize conspecifics, and they have a very elaborate mating courtship behavior where the females recognize these dances that are done by the males, And that's an important part of their courtship behavior, which they do with these very high resolution eyes. Okay, so this is just showing some of their typical behavior here. This is just on the right here is a movie of a one-day-old jumping spider. And when they're very young, like this, then the exoskeleton is translucent. So you can actually see through it. You can see these tubes, which are shown over here on the left. You see these tubes moving back and forth. So what they're doing is they're taking this one-dimensional strip of a retina, scanning it back and forth to sort of analyze what's out there in the world. This is kind of very typical behavior you see of them. They're always looking around, kind of and checking out the world visually, like this. They have all the behaviors of a predator. Okay, so they do this tracking, orienting behavior. They stalk their prey and so forth, which you'll see in some of these other other movies. So one of the prototypical behaviors is are these orienting maneuvers. Where, as I mentioned, if an object is presented in the field of view of these low resolution eyes, then they quickly reorient the body and the head towards it so they can scan it with these high resolution eyes. And this is just showing some of the data from behavioral studies that these orienting turns are very precisely match the orientation, the location of objects in the world. So they're pretty accurate. Okay, so I'll just show again some more movies, just like their informal behavior here. So here's a jumping spider. Again, it's a one-day-old spider tracking a fruit fly, Drosophila. Okay, so this is kind of typical of what you'd see. So they're just locking onto it, and you can see these eyes inside the head are fixated on that object and tracking it very closely. And then this is just showing a sequence where it's actually going to capture the fly. And you can see some of these stalking maneuvers where they sort of creep up on it and they try to estimate how far away it is. Again, this is the first time the spider has ever done this in his life, so it's not quite right all the time initially. Makes a few messes, but eventually you see it gets it. Okay, so I think one of the things I want to kind of hope you see here is there's a lot of problem solving here, distance estimation, having to deal with novel situations, and it's sort of a non-trivial way to sort of plan actions and figure out what to do in this situation. And these animals are very successful at it right from birth. So finally gets it. So this is what vision is all about, by the way, right? Is the ability to do this. Okay, so they have this marvelous visual system which allows them to do this. And so, another one of the really interesting behaviors that you see in the wild when they make these reorienting turns is they'll orient in the correct direction even when the object that they're trying to pursue is not in view. So these were experiments done by David Hill at Cornell in the late 70s. So here is just showing a sequence where the spider sees this fly on a lure here, but it can't get there directly by jumping at it. So it has to take a detour down the stem and goes back up. And then actually in this case, he removes the lure after initially sees it. So it's no longer there. So it can't be sort of tracking it with its other part of its visual system. And then it occasionally makes these reorienting turns in order to just sort of check out where it is. And what he noticed is that they always tend to reorient in the correct direction, okay, updating where the spider's new location in the space. So to study this more carefully in the laboratory, he built this arena where the spider and this starts out in the center here, and it can move back and forth along this track. And it's presented a prey item here out initially at some position, here in this case, a position 2. And then as soon as it sees it, it's removed from view. And now it has to go try to get it. And so it has to walk along this track to a new position to get closer to it. And then when it gets to another location on the track, it makes this reorienting turn towards the object in order to sort of check where it is. And then what he looks at is the angle of that reorienting turn and compares it to what it actually should be. So this is on the horizontal axis here is plotted the actual angle that it, the correct angle to 2 here that it should be. Against what it actually does. And you can see here it's doing a pretty good job of turning in the correct direction. So it implies almost that they're doing some kind of trigonometry in their head, that they can update, keep track of how far they've gone to update where in their own mind where this object now is in the world. And an even more stunning and maybe surprising set of experiments were done by Tarsitano and Jackson on a particular jumping spider called Portia. And they looked at its ability to solve these 3-dimensional mazes. So basically what they do is they place the jumping spider at the top of this pedestal, and it can see a prey item in one of these 2 different trays, okay, in this tray or this tray. and they look what it does. And so what's interesting about this is first of all, those trays are too far away for the spider to jump directly at it. And so it has to sort of initially walk to it. And so what they notice is that the first thing the spider does when presented with this scene is that it doesn't just immediately try to crawl towards the object. It sort of stops and visually inspects the scene. It sort of moves its head back and forth and scans the scene with its eyes, and then makes a movement down the pedestal and towards the prey item. And this is just showing where it goes. So if you put the prey item in this tray here, route A, then what they're showing here is that most of the time, okay, when it comes down the pole, it's not simply doing some kind of random searching to find the right pole. It goes to the correct pole. It goes to the base of this pole here and climbs up to get it. If you put it in prey B, then it actually climbs over here. And again, this is away from the object. Actually, it's moving to the opposite side of where it sees the item to go to the right pole. Okay, so you can even do that when the pole is planted in back of the pedestal. So again, it starts here, kind of scans its environment, crawls down the pole, goes away from the prey item, and then to climb up to this wire to get it in route A. So again, it doesn't do that all the time, but most of the time. The vast majority of the time is going to the right base location here on the pole. Okay, so all these experiments seem to point to the idea that with these very advanced, highly elaborate visual systems, the very high resolution and very, by the way, I have to, testament to how the system is designed. It's a beautiful optical system. And one of the reasons why you have these long tubes here to get high resolution is because in order to get high resolution, you need a long focal length. Okay, so the system had to sort of push a lot of matter out of the way inside the head to create the space to have these high resolution eyes. Okay, so it sort of physically, mechanically went to a lot of work in order to design these visual systems to make it this particular way. Okay, so these eyes are highly advanced. At the same time, what these behavioral experiments seem to suggest is that it's using this very rich visual information to build internal models of its environment and doing some kind of three-dimensional reasoning about the world in these novel situations in order to be able to find objects. Okay, so that's the jumping spider. Very quickly mention a kind of related idea, and again, this is sort of a system you find in many animals now, are these head direction cells. And so the question here is, how does an animal know where it's heading in three-dimensional space? And so in the 1980s, they found these cells in rats that seem to be tuned to head direction. So in other words, the direction the animal is heading. So each neuron seems to be tuned to a different direction of space in which the animal is heading. And a model that's been developed for the system is a so-called ring attractor model. And the idea is that these neurons are connected together in a recurrent neural network in a ring topology. And then the activity across this population, so black means it's a high activity, gray means lower activity, and white means no activity. The activity across this population indicates which direction the animal is heading in, much like an internal compass, okay? And so this is a model that's been well developed. There's a lot of empirical support for it. And so the idea is that these neurons, these neurons inside the rat's brain that represent heading direction, they don't directly correspond to any one sensory modality. They're getting input from many different modalities, from vision, from the vestibular system, from auditory system and so forth, somatosensory, from the whisking system, presumably. And then they use these different sensory modalities to update this representation. So for example, if the vestibular system sends a signal that is turning right, then it momentarily modulates these connections in the ring attractor. And so the bump of activity across this population shifts to the right. And then when you're no longer turning right, it will simply hold that pattern of activity as the new heading direction. And if another neuron says you're turning to the left, then it will turn back to the left. And again, once that goes off, it will hold that activity pattern. So these have been studied a lot in rats. And so a really stunning set of experiments about 5 years ago in Vivek Jayaraman's lab at the Geneva farm showed that the flies actually, fruit flies, Drosophila, actually have these head direction cells as well. And even more surprisingly, they reside in this body, in this nucleus within the fly's brain called the ellipsoid body. So believe it or not, it's actually a set of neurons in the nucleus that are connected together in a ring. So anatomically, they're all connected together into a ring. You can see that very clearly in anatomy. And these neurons are now thought to be connected together in a ring attractor network, just like people have developed for the rat. The kind of stunning thing about that, when people developed this model for the rat, they didn't actually think that there's physically a ring in the rat's brain, but they were just simply connected this way. And so this sort of stunning thing here is that in the fly's brain, they actually really are a ring. And you can see that here in this animation as the fly is turning on this trackball. Then with calcium imaging, they can see the activity of these neurons in the ring change and move around as the fly changes direction in space. Okay, so I think what all this is pointing to is, not just our mammalian ancestors or reptilian ancestors, but even our insect and spider ancestors are forming internal representations of the world. They're not simply reacting to stimuli directly with the motor system. They're taking the sensory information, forming internal representations which are unlike any one of these sensory modalities to form an abstract representation of where you are heading in the world. And it's using these internal representations, internally built representations to guide actions. Okay, so that's a little bit about, maybe I'm going to call maybe common sense reasoning from the worlds of spiders, especially, and maybe flies, and who knows, I'm sure we could come up with similar examples in bees that exhibit their ability to geometrically reason about their environment. So the next question is, well, how is all this done? What's the neural machinery? What kind of neural computations allow us to do these kinds of geometric manipulations? And so maybe we can sort of pose this very simply here with this example of a square. When you see that same square in a different pose, a different scale, and different orientation, it's the same object. Well, how is it that this thing is the same as that thing? Well, we understand that those are related to a transformation, okay? And in fact, if I were going to show you these as a sequence, this is a frame 1 and this frame 2, you would actually experience that transformation as a parent motion. So this is really sort of, again, a fundamental part of how we see the world, about how we relate things to each other, is through these transformations. Now, people have wondered about this for a long time. How is it we do these transformations? There's a long and storied history, and probably the first piece of work along these lines was by Walter Pitts and Warren McCullough. This is the same Pitts and McCullough who developed the McCullough-Pitts model of neurons, which was the sort of predecessor to the perceptron model. And so their model is basically shown here. So they wondered, the question is, how do you recognize a square as being a square, even though it's a different position or size and orientation in the visual field? Or how is it that you recognize a chord as being a particular, like a major chord, irrespective of where it is in the musical scale? So this diagram here is showing their circuit for how you recognize invariance in audition. So for example, a chord. But the same idea would be in vision, like if you were trying to recognize some pattern translated in the image. And the idea here is that the pattern is conveyed by these wires here going up, these wires that are going up here. So that would be representing sort of like that, in this case, a tonotopic representation of an auditory pattern, or this could be a visual pattern here proceeding from left to right. And the information about this pattern is sent forward into this sort of crossbar network. And at each row here, one of these neurons are making one-to-one connections with the neurons in each row. But except the idea here is that as you go up each level, that those connections that it's making are simply shifted to the right. Okay, so this is just taking the pattern represented on these wires and delivering it to these neurons here, one-to-one, but simply shifted to the right by 1. And in this row, shifted to the right by 2, shifted to the right by 3, and so forth. And then the idea is that these neurons over here make multiplicative gating connections with each of these neurons in each row, so that it would select out a particular transformation. So if this neuron is activated, then it would basically take the pattern represented on these units coming in, and then shift it to the right by 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so when you turn on this neuron here, it takes the pattern and shifts it to the right by 4. So it's basically a kind of neural shifter circuit that they proposed for computing these transformations. And they proposed a similar kind of idea for doing scaling transformations in the visual cortex, similarly using this gating idea to represent these different transformations of visual input and for rotations. Okay, so that's a very early idea, and I'm going to tell you now about some other wild and crazy ideas kind of along these lines. But before I do, I want to disabuse you of the notion that the brain works anything like this. Okay, so one of the reasons why Walter Pitts was able to come up with this model, but I'll just back up a slide. The reason why Walter Pitts was able to come up with this model is because he wasn't polluted with the idea of the perceptron yet. Okay, it had not yet been invented. And actually, there's a kind of interesting side story about Walter Pitts. He was a very colorful character. He was widely recognized as a genius at the time. People like John von Neumann and Norbert Wiener very much were inspired by him and sought him out as a source of inspiration. And he was on the verge of, he was working on his PhD thesis on a model of three-dimensional computation in the brain, and unfortunately burned his PhD thesis. So we'll never know about that. But he was definitely ahead of his time, coming up with lots of interesting and creative ideas for difficult computational problems that the brain has to solve. Okay, so I'm going to tell you some ideas along these lines. And so I think the reason why I mentioned this is because it seems to me like our field is kind of trapped in this particular kind of model or framework of thinking about things now. And the kind of neural computations we do, they're all sort of this flavor of perceptron units and then stacked perceptrons. And when I ask people like, why are you doing that? And oftentimes the answer will be because, well, that's kind of how neurons work, and maybe we're sort of loosely modeling it after brains. But I just want to make sure everybody knows this has nothing to do with how brains work. Okay, so it was Frank Rosenblatt's initial idea in the late 1950s. He came up with this, and it's a time when nobody knew how brains work. And it's been a very useful kind of computational abstraction. We've been able to use it for all kinds of things. But now as neuroscience has progressed over 50, 60 years, we've learned a lot about how neurons actually work. And we see that they're capable of doing much, much richer computational things than this. And so just to give you a couple of examples, and I think one of the main points here is that neurons, they compute with the geometry of their dendrites, and their dendrites are arranged in very particular ways in order to achieve certain computational goals. Okay, and in most places you look in the brain, you see very specific kinds of circuits designed to do specific kinds of computations. Okay, it's not like you just have one generic perceptron thing that's happening everywhere, and you kind of just adjust the weights, and then it does something magically different. Okay, so you see kind of these circuits that you see in the brain that seem to be well thought out by someone to do particular kinds of things. And so one example is the starburst amacrine cell in the retina. These have a very interesting kind of starburst shape. And the reason why is because they're using their dendrites to compute motion. So they use basically traveling waves along these dendrites. As a bar is moving across the visual field, then that creates a traveling wave in this particular direction. And then these neurons release GABA onto retinal ganglion cells in order to inhibit them for that direction of motion, so that they're more selective in the other direction of motion, actually. Okay, but it's the morphology, the geometry of these neurons that allows them to collect motion. They're using compute motion, and they're using more of a traveling wave idea to do that. This is another example from the barn owl, where these neurons that are used to compute sound, the location of a sound in space, they compare the timing differences between the left and the right ears. And basically there was this model proposed quite a long time ago called the Jeffress model, where the idea is that you take information from the left ear and information from the right ear, and then delay them by different amounts. And you have these comparator neurons sitting at different points, comparing time delays between the left and right ears. And the way you would create these delays is simply by the propagation delay, the time it takes an axon potential to travel down an axon. Okay, so since this is a longer wire that it has to go down, then it's going to be more delayed here than here. Okay, and then you see this exact same circuit basically laid out in the nucleus laminaris of the barn owl, where it's using these delay lines to take information from one ear and with one set of delays and information from the other ear. And then they have these comparator circuits, which are comparing those signals between the left and right ears to compute interaural time differences. Okay, so these are just two particular examples. And I'd like to steer you to this book here, this wonderful book that came out recently by Peter Sterling and Simon Laughlin on principles of neural design, where they go into many other such examples of how neurons have been very, very carefully designed to do certain things. And I think the same idea, I would claim it holds for the cortex as well. Okay, that we can see similar kinds of structured computations going on there. Okay, so it's not just sort of like you do this and repeat it ad nauseum and then a miracle happens. Okay, so I wanted to sort of, I'll mention that as one more example, which is the most important of all, which is that these neurons, why do I say they're not just computing a weighted sum like a perceptron model? Okay, so this is just showing you filled neuron, a pyramidal cell. This is its soma. These are all its dendrites. And one of the things we know now about how these neurons actually collect signals on the dendritic tree is they do it compartmentally. So in other words, each of these dendritic branches has maybe several compartments along it, so that inputs that combine together within one compartment will combine much differently than between different departments, say an input coming in over there versus an input coming over here. So it's not just taking a weighted sum of its inputs. And so what we know is that within a compartment, these inputs tend to combine more multiplicatively. Okay, so that one neuron can actually veto another, or it can amplify another's inputs, or gate another neuron's input when they combine on the same compartment, but not when they combine within different branches of the dendritic tree. Okay, so rather than being just a weighted sum of inputs, a better model of a neuron is that it's maybe something more like a sigma pi unit, where it's taking a weighted sum of nonlinear combinations on its dendritic tree. So it's a much richer computational structure. Any given neuron within the brain, a pyramidal cell, is a much richer computational structure than a simple perceptron model. Okay, so the reason why I want to mention this is because we can actually use this richer computational structure to do more interesting things. And so one example of that is this class of bilinear models, which people have used for computing transformations, geometric transformations. So the first example of which is this Pitts and McCullough model that I mentioned back in 1947. Jeff Hinton has proposed over the years many sort of different instantiations as this idea, where you use one set of neurons to multiplicatively gate the connections between a set of features and another set of units in an object-centered reference frame. This was part of my own PhD thesis, inspired actually by both of these people in developing a dynamic routing model of attention. Josh Tenenbaum, Bill Freeman, their model for separating style and content. David Arithorn's map-seeking circuits, which use this wonderful principle of superposition to search through the space of all possible transformations. Again, are sort of built this way. There's work from Raj Rao's lab, and again from Jeff Hinton and with these higher order Boltzmann machines. But the flavor of all these models is shown here. Basically, the idea is you're going to take the image data. So I sub I would be simply like the ith pixel in the image, okay? And you're going to represent that as a multiplicative combination of two sets of latent variables. One which represents something about the pose or style of the object there in the scene, and another set of units which represents something about the shape. And so that's something that all these models share in common, okay? And so now, and then you have this sort of three-way weight or tensor term, which tells you how much the kth unit here for the pose or style modulates the ith jth synapse between unit aj and unit I in the input. Okay, so when we just sort of think about the sum over k here, then all of this collapses into, basically we can think of it as a weight that's dynamically modifiable by these, let's call them control neurons, C, that control the pose or the style of this transformation, okay? So this is maybe, now you're back to sort of like a simple linear generative model between some latent variables A and the image data, but now we can change the transformation dynamically through these other units C, okay? So if we want to shift the object to the left or rotate it, or do some other kind of geometric transformation, we can do that by changing these units, by appropriately designing these weights gamma, I, j, k to implement these different transformations. Okay, so that's one idea that's, I think, been around, been sort of floated and been exercised in a variety of different realms. And I think there's very promising work coming out there. But one of the disadvantages, I think, of this way of doing things is that you need a different neuron CK, for each and every transformation and for each and every incremental transformation. So for example, if you want to rotate by 10 degrees, that would be one of these C sub Ks. And if you want to rotate by 15 degrees, well, then now you would need a different C sub K for that, okay? So different neurons would represent different amounts of rotation or different amounts of translation or different amounts of scaling and so forth. So you need one neuron for each and every transformation like that. And it would be nice to have something that more clearly, more explicitly represents the actual geometric transformation. So more this idea of equivariance, where a neuron would change its activity up and down as the neuron, let's say, as the image translates left and right. Okay, and this we get with this idea of Lie groups for modeling transformation. So Lie groups is basically the mathematics for describing transformations. And I won't try to recapitulate all the ideas here, but basically what it boils down to is that in many cases, you can describe these transformations in terms of it very elegantly and compactly in terms of a matrix exponential. Okay, so that's simply shown here. If we have some reference object here, so I naught would be our image of some template or reference object, then we can transform it into a new representation, a translated, let's say, or rotated image of the object by simply multiplying by this matrix exponential. And so this very simple equation actually hides a lot of complexity because e to the at, t is just a scalar, a is a matrix, okay? E to the at is not simply each of the elements of that matrix exponentiated, okay? So it's actually, it changes this matrix in a very non-trivial and very complicated and very hard to compute way, actually, okay? But it forms a very nice, elegant mathematical compact description of what we want to do. Okay, so if we design this matrix A to be the spatial derivative of this image, then as you change t, then the object here will translate, okay? If we design A to be the rotational derivative of this, of the image in the image plane, then as we change t, the image will rotate and so forth, okay? So you can design this matrix A in different ways to implement different transformations. So we simply take this one scalar value t and move it up and down, then the image will change, transforming in interesting ways. Okay, so again, this idea has been explored by a number of different labs, or by Raj Rao's lab, by my own lab. About 10 years ago, we did a lot of work in this area, and then more recently by Taco Cohen and Max Welling. And so I'm going to tell you about some more recent work we've been doing, which is kind of inspired by their recent progress in this area. And I think it's worth mentioning that an interesting tie between these Lie group transformation models and the bilinear models that I just told you, as you can see, for small values of t, you can approximate that as just the identity matrix plus a times t. And now you can see the relationship to a bilinear model. But basically, this variable t is multiplying these variables here. So you could take this I naught and represent it by another set of latent variables. And then you're back to this sort of bilinear form in the generative model, okay? Okay, so the example we pursued here based on the Taco Cohen and Max Welling work, and again, this is just, here we are back to MNIST, okay? We started with jumping spiders, and we're now here in the simple MNIST world. But again, just think of this as a kind of a very toy basic problem that sort of tries to get this at the essence of what a system would need to do geometric reasoning. And of course, one would need to build on this to make it to deal with much more complicated types of imagery. Okay, but what we train it on here is this rotated MNIST task, because these are just simply MNIST digits, and each digit is a particular style. It's not all the different styles of MNIST. There's one particular 5, one particular 6, one particular 8, but rotated in all different orientations. Okay, so we're just going to give you a training set of all these different digits rotated by different amounts. And the problem the system has to figure out is, well, what's going on? Okay, so what's going on here is actually very simple. We have 10 different digits that are being rotated. Okay, so the generative model we're going to propose for doing that is the combination of a sparse coding model. So we have these latent variables alpha, which are sparse code, and a dictionary phi of 10 different elements. And so what we want phi to do is converge to learn about these 10 different digits that are present in this world. And this transformation t should learn about the idea of rotation. And s is a single scalar variable which will tell us how much rotation. Okay, we're going to represent this in terms of this Lie algebra, in terms of a matrix exponential. Okay, so that we're just going to simply take the sparse code of what we think is there, and then transform it with this matrix exponential to describe what's in the image. Okay, so the details of that, I mean, you can read Taco Cohen's paper to get more of it, but basically, to do the learning and the inference in this, we take this matrix A and actually do an SVD decomposition that allows us then to confine, we can basically confine the matrix exponential to the diagonalized part of that matrix. So if it's a skew symmetric matrix, which it is in this case, then we could decompose the diagonal term is actually sort of a block diagonal with these sort of 2 by 2 elements, block diagonal. Okay, and when we exponentiate this matrix sigma, then it just basically gives us these 2 by 2 sines and cosines by different amounts, but all controlled by a single variable s. Okay, so that's this form down here. Okay, so this is the model we're actually learning. So the things we want to learn here basically are phi, our dictionary of different shapes, and W, which is going to do a transformation which enables us to transform the image appropriately with a single parameter S. Okay. Okay, so then this can all be put in a probabilistic framework, and basically it amounts to alternating between two different steps. One is estimating a posterior over the rotation S, and then trying to infer the sparse code, and then re-estimating the posterior, re-estimating the sparse code, and iteratively going back and forth between these two to do the inference. And then just simply to the learning of W and phi is done by gradient descent on the subjective function. Okay. So first of all, I'll just show you the results without the transformation. So if we simply take this, if we take this rotated MNIST data set and simply do sparse coding on it, which is obviously the wrong thing, but that's kind of the point here, all right? If you just sort of say, well, gosh, what are the patterns in this world? Then this is what it learns, okay? It's sort of some weird blurred amalgam of maybe sort of digits and different configurations. And it can describe, it's going to sort of struggle to describe each of these rotated digits in terms of these 10 different templates combined together, but it can kind of approximate them somewhat well. But you can see it's kind of a nonsensical combination. It sort of takes this weird squiggly shape combined together with sort of a ghostly 9 and ghostly 0 and combines those, and it says, okay, well, describe what's there. Okay, but it's not really a meaningful description of what's there in the world, and it's not particularly making a good approximation either. It's missing a lot of information. But now what we're going to do here is simply augment this representation with one additional scalar variable. That's what's kind of remarkable about this. Okay, so we have 10 alphas here, one for each of these dictionary elements phi, and we're going to add one more scalar to it, S. Okay, but with the right mathematical structure from this Lie algebra, and now we can actually learn the structure of this world. Okay, so now the dictionary converges upon these 10 different digits that are present in the scene, and W, interestingly, learns a rotational Fourier basis. Basically, it's what it's doing as a Fourier transform. One way to think about this, these patterns, each of these patterns is multiplied with the image through an inner product, right? You take the inner product of each one of these functions with the image, okay? It's basically a Fourier transform along the angular axis. And what this allows you to do is rotate basically through a phase shift in the Fourier domain. Okay, so that's what's being done here. Okay, so once you do this, now you've come up with a much more sensible way of describing these digits. If I show you, for example, this object here, that it says, okay, well, that's something I know about, I've seen before. That's this canonical object in this pose, rotated by that amount. Okay, and so forth. And then this 3, this rotated is says, okay, well, that's a 3, something I've seen before, rotated by a different amount. Okay. And so now what's interesting about it is not only can it understand and come up with a more meaningful representation of its world in terms of a set of shapes and transformations acting upon them. So this is representing the posterior distribution over that angle. I'm sorry for not explaining that. This is the image, the reconstruction. This is the posterior over the transformation S, the single, basically their angle of rotation. And then this is just each dictionary element weighted by its value, inferred value alpha. Okay, so once you've done this learning, it's learned basically the general idea of rotation. So potentially we could show it a new object it's never seen before, and it would now understand what that new object would look like in all these different rotations. Okay, it would be able to generalize to these different different points of view. Okay, so as I said, this is still early days, but it's just meant as kind of a very simple example of the idea we're sort of thinking about, the kind of computations that brains would have to do in order to reason geometrically about the world. And so I hope I've told you something interesting about the world of jumping spiders, that you can see a lot of this general purpose reasoning in animals way back in the evolutionary chain, back to insects and spiders. And this geometric reasoning is really necessary to allow them to survive in the environment, to navigate, to orient, to plan routes, to capture prey. And finally, I really think that this is what maybe the idea I want to leave you with, is that I think that this idea of Lie algebras, from the Lie group theory, is really fundamental. It's really the fundamental mathematical way to describe transformations. And so we should be thinking about, how do neural circuits do this, right? How can you design circuits that implement these kinds of Lie group transformations? And this is just sort of a simple example along those lines. Okay, so that's basically it for me.
Thank you very much, Bruno, for the very inspiring talk. as usual. So we have many questions already. We can start with the first one by Mofichu. I think you can talk now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so first of all, thanks for such an informative talk. So you give an example of the information process by 2 years by delaying the information. So I just wondering whether the information from the multiple modalities, say audio, visual modalities, are processed in the similar way in the human brain. That means, say, audio or visual modality to capture the geometric transformations in a similar way or not.
Okay, so I wasn't getting all of that, but it sounds like you're asking about are these sort of audio visual transformations captured in a similar way in the brain?
Yeah, that means the 2 years, that is in the slide you mentioned that they process, the ears process the information by delaying the information.
Yes.
Whether the multiple modality also process in the similar way in the human brain.
Well, you know, it matters what part of the brain you go into. I mean, like there are certainly areas in the cortex that are doing this sort of multimodal fusion of auditory and visual information. The particular kinds of transformations I think that are being done are much more murky. But another place where you see this happening is in the superior colliculus or in the midbrain, which is a sort of a subcortical structure where the neurons form a spatial map from auditory information. And they also form a visual map coming from the retina. And one of the interesting things there that has to happen is another kind of coordinate transformation has to take place, because when you move your eyes, now the image data is changing with respect to your head, right? And you're localizing the sound in space with respect to your head and forming an auditory map in head-centered coordinates. And in the retina, you have a map of what's out there in the world in retinal coordinates. And now when you move your eyes, that changes, right? So there has to be some kind of correspondence made. And people have looked at that, and you see something. It's kind of, you know, like a lot of things in biology, it's not exact. It's not exactly what you would expect. It's sort of doing half of the transformation. It's sort of shifting a little bit in the direction you might expect. Whether that involves delay lines, I mean, it's a whole nother matter. I mean, I think one of the points I wanted to make here is that you see basically the morphology of these neural circuits basically suggest to you a lot of what they're doing computationally. And so I would expect, like, you know, in this model of McCulloch and Pitts, you know, in order to compute these visual transformations, well, the wires kind of have to go in a certain way to do that. And my dream would be to find such things. I think if you could find such circuits, and my guess is, you know, maybe something like that is there. People just haven't looked. But the only way we're going to know what to look for is by fleshing out these theories, by developing more concrete theories of these group transformations. And how would that be done in the anatomy? And then we'd have something more concrete to look for.
Thank you.
Thanks. Next, we have a question by Aaron. Aaron, would you like to speak it?
Okay, well, I've been wondering for a long time whether there's more going on in brains than the neural nets can support because of our abilities to discover impossibility, which is not something that can be derived from statistics or its obvious necessary connections, as was done in ancient geometry, for instance, and topology. And I've just wondered whether the suggestion some neuroscientists are making, namely that a vast amount of subneural chemical activity is performing important reasoning computations, is something you've considered. And if you think it's wrong, perhaps you could tell us why.
No, I mean, I think, yeah, the computations are occurring at all levels, you know, through chemical and molecular gradients across membranes up until, you know, voltages propagating through neurons. So I think it's definitely at all levels. I thought the idea of impossibility you were asking about is like, how do we recognize something as being impossible?
Yes, or necessarily true.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, I just wanted to use that as an excuse to get back. I mean, because I meant to mention that I think this is you know, the touch base back to what John was talking about, these intuitive physics ideas, right? And so this ability to learn and understand things about transformations also lets us know kind of what is impossible, right? In a way, like what would be highly implausible if an object sort of morphed and changed in a completely non-physical way. Well, then we would be like, wow, that's bizarre, you know, but how do we know that? Well, because it doesn't fit our model of the transformations we've learned about things that don't.
And that doesn't fitting is something that can be represented as an impossibility, not just a low probability. Because
yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, yeah, right. Because I'm just sort of saying it'd be low probability, but yeah.
Okay, thanks. So we're kind of running out of time, but maybe one more question from Utkarsh.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was amazing. I just had a couple of questions about the rotated MNIST example. So the first question was, it seems that in the visualization, all the digits recovered were upright, or a majority of them were upright. Is that something that was recovered by the example? Oh, sorry, that was recovered by the model, or is it just
you mean like the actual orientation of the learned? Yeah, that's sort of arbitrary. I don't know why. Okay. I don't know if Ho Yin's on the line. You could say, but actually, I should say that for this particular example, the range of rotations was somewhat limited between -75 and +75 degrees. So there might be a bias here, but you're right. I mean, it's a little kind of suspicious they're all upright. It should be sort of totally arbitrary what, you know, the orientation of each of these learned templates.
Makes sense. And a follow-up question was that in this case, we had to sort of hand code this, the matrix exponential for the rotation, right? Do you think there might be a more general approach that can sort of learn the Lie group as well?
Well, okay, so like I'm using T. I'm using T here, but it's not time. Okay. So it's just a number, right? So, but it can be time, and that's kind of interesting. It sort of begs, you know, goes back to like, how would you implement this? And it turns out, well, this is actually the solution to a first order differential equation of the form I dot equals A times I. Okay, so one possibility is that you could actually implement this via a dynamical system, and that would then propagate, take an object and propagate it across the map, or propagate it in order to rotate it and so forth. And that's another, I think, interesting possibility I'd like to explore.
Great, thank you.